Well, good afternoon, friends. Welcome to our next episode of Face to Face with Racism. I'm Jeffrey Moore,
And Heather Goddess.
and we're pastors at St. Stephen United Methodist Church in Mesquite, Texas. We're glad you've joined us this afternoon. This week, our topic is costumes and mascots. We thought this would be timely as we approach Halloween. So we're going to be talking today about how costumes and mascots function as covert forms of racism and white supremacy. And our guest today will be Tony Adler. Tony is a local educator. I'll let him introduce ourselves, and then hopefully soon we'll be joined by Silver Perry from the Navajo Nation. So, Tony, introduce yourselves to us, and I know you have some thoughts you'd like to share. Start out with.
Yeah, first of all, thank you, Jeffrey and Heather, for having me. I'm excited to be here. When I first, well, I guess by way of introduction, I'm an English teacher and also teach outdoor education and service learning at St. John's Episcopal School. And when you first contacted me about this episode, the thing that caught my interest is that it's a particular area in which I haven't developed a strong viewpoint. And I was really interested in having the conversation and perhaps further developing that viewpoint. So as I tried to come up with some sort of introductory statement about where my head's at, I found myself pulled in different directions by different beliefs that I hold pretty strongly, which made it challenging. And so what I thought I might do is read some of those statements of belief and start there. Start with my confusion, and hopefully we'll arrive somewhere useful. So I was advised by a friend that reading these statements as I believe sounds a bit challenging. It sounds a bit like I'm inviting an argument. And so I'm going to read them that way, but I want to preface it by saying I believe these as of this moment on October 4th, and I am eager and willing to update my views when necessary. So hopefully that will avoid that tripwire. So I believe as a society, we need to care for those who are vulnerable. I believe that conversations about race and culture in America often lack complexity, and without that, they threaten to divide us further. I believe cultural appreciation is one of the most beautiful things about living in a multi-ethnic and multicultural society. I believe that cultural appropriation, when narrowly defined, can be hurtful and provides an opportunity to educate. I believe understanding broad patterns throughout different cultures is important, but that treating people as individuals is even more important. And I believe there must be room for differing values in our society. So all of those sort of yank at me in different ways on this issue, and I'm just not quite sure how to reconcile them.
I think that's a solid pack of beliefs. Would you be willing to share some more about how you feel those pull you in different directions, or some of the directions you feel they pull you?
Yeah, sure. And there's a couple thoughts I had that I omitted because I felt like I look at things often through the lens of raising children. I think that's due to my profession and also being a parent to two girls. And I'm concerned. So I'll read one more that I omitted but left on the page because I felt like it was a little far afield to open with. But I believe we must raise our children to be resilient and strengthen their armor for the fact that the world is not always going to be a safe space. Mm-hmm. I believe that strongly. I also believe in cultural competency, cultural sensitivity, and I believe these conversations become polarized. And mm-hmm. So I feel myself pulled between those poles. do we as a society become, do we find ourselves in a place where we're searching for the problematic at times and identifying it in areas where maybe we shouldn't? I think we do. Do we also, as a society, dismiss real pain that's been caused to people and groups? I think we do. And I suppose there's the push and the pull, is trying to find the place on the continuum that feels right.
Right. So I mean, you haven't said anything that I wouldn't necessarily agree with yet. So I'm not sure what your friend was concerned about.
I think tone. I think he didn't want me to. I'm laying down what I believe, and I dare you.
Right. It could sound sort of like, here's the gauntlet. I think one of the hardest things in the conversation, as you, particularly with respect to the last couple of things that you mentioned, in terms of dismissing injury to groups of people. It is ironic to me a little bit that we live in an age right now where people who occupy the dominant culture are perfectly willing to assert that, one, they have their own perspective on things, and two, their own perspective is 100% valid, and three, their perspective need not be reconciled with your perspective. We might, as an example, although I don't want to reduce it to, put, alternative facts into that kind of bucket, right? Well, this is the way I see it, and this is my reality, and I don't need to change. And they're perfectly fine with that when it comes to competing perspectives within the dominant culture. When a person from the non-dominant culture steps forward and says, this is my reality, this is how I perceive that, what's happened to me or what you're doing or anything, then that is dismissed and says, well, that can't be true, right? Because I don't intend that, I didn't participate in that, I don't whatever. And so that competing view cannot obtain and must be dismissed.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a double standard there.
Yeah.
Which I think, is not surprisingly driven by power. If we're going to maintain power, then we can't have views which compete with our own. In terms of the redistribution of power. So I don't have to worry about competing with your view if it doesn't mean that I don't have to give up power. But if it's going to mean a substantial remaking of power in terms of the broader culture, then that happens.
Well, I also think it's not just having to give up power, but also having to admit that something I've understood my whole life might not be right.
Yeah.
Might actually be wrong. So when we're talking about specifically about costumes and mascots, Tony, would you mind reading your two beliefs on cultural appropriation and cultural appreciation again?
Sure. I wrote, I believe cultural appreciation is one of the most beautiful things about living in a multi-ethnic and multicultural society. And then I believe that cultural appropriation, when narrowly defined, can be hurtful and provides an opportunity to educate. And I suppose if I were to offer a starting definition of cultural appropriation, I would say something like casual treatment of the sacred.
I think that's excellent.
I think that's a good start. We have a episode actually on cultural appropriation. that we aired earlier this summer. And one of the main things that came out of that conversation was relationship. That when cultural images or imagery or sacred is assumed by someone from another culture outside of relationship, then it tends towards appropriation rather than appreciation.
I'm sorry, Jeffrey, can you say that one more time?
When it is assumed by someone from another culture, in most of our cases by someone in the dominant culture, with outside of a relationship with someone in the culture, then it is in danger of tending towards appropriation rather than appreciation.
Got it.
So I'm thinking about this week, as I was thinking about being in conversation with Silver, who's a member of the Navajo Nation, I was reminded of a costume that my mother made for me when I was in elementary school that I was very proud of, and I kept it for many, many years in my closet. It was an Indian costume. And I'm pretty sure it started out as an Indian costume for Peter Pan play.
Yeah.
And
one of those.
You know, it had fringe all the way down the side, and I had no real true knowledge of any Native American culture. I don't want to say Native American culture monolithically, because that's another problem in and of itself, right? I mean, the fact that it was an Indian costume to start with, that it flattened a whole wide variety of cultures into a single image and then reduced it to this sort of caricature. You know, that's a kind of a cultural appropriation and flattening. It was a word you used that I can't remember what it was, but it'll come back to me. That is, I think, what one of the things, at least, that we want to guard against in terms of this navigating this issue.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that that flattening you're talking about and the making a caricature is the key, especially in the costume piece of it. So, right, when you go in to a costume store, I won't name any because I don't want to be mean, but you go into a costume store and you look at options for Native American costumes. What you find are generally two costumes. You have the brave, right, or the warrior, and you have the princess. And it minimizes the depth and breadth of the culture that exists to two caricatures that portray a certain stereotype about Native Americans.
Yeah, it just reduces them to sort of the noble savage.
Right. And when we think about how Native Americans were portrayed historically as savages, as warriors, as dangerous, right? Like, those are all things that when we choose to wear that as a costume, that perpetuates that. It may seem like a little tiny thing, but in the grand scheme of it, it perpetuates that idea that's all that exists within the Native American culture, and that it's far from that. What are some other? I mean, I'm trying to think what other costumes are a good example of that.
Do you mind if I bring up an issue for y'all to consider?
Yeah.
So a couple of things that came up when I was talking to some friends about this topic were, well, one thing that I read in an article or a blog post from a mom who was concerned with her daughter's choice of Moana as a costume.
Mm.
And as, are we still talking?
Yeah. Can you?
Okay, there we go.
Good.
Sorry, train of thought. Okay, so in this article it said that that Moana was made with very careful consideration to honoring Polynesian culture, and I don't know that to be true. I don't know anything about Polynesian culture really. So if we can just assume that's true for the sake of the question, her concern was over appropriation, and then she thought, well, I could buy the costume from a Polynesian person who makes them, and then there's some authenticity and there can be education, but then that's still not our culture. And in a circumstance like that, where if we're assuming that the movie is in fact a respectful representation of Polynesian culture, this little girl has found a strong, courageous hero that she wants to represent on Halloween. And I have a hard time sharing that mom's concern. And I wonder what you guys might say in that instance.
Yeah.
I have a lot of thoughts running around that sort of tie in tangentially to that, but don't directly answer the question. So bear with me here for a minute. I want to take a step back and think about how, let's start with the question, what's the big deal about wearing costumes? Like, why does this even matter? People have been wearing costumes for literally centuries. So how can this possibly be racist? Now, we're not going to answer that question in 13 minutes. But I think it's important to think about these things. It may be that, again, more historically, costumes tended to focus on fantastical representations or non
Race or ethnic. Yeah.
well, I'm gonna like not even real
Right.
person. You're not trying to replicate a real something that you could find in life. You're doing something that's fantastical, okay?
Yes.
That's removed from reality. So it's a way actually of escaping reality, escaping the natural into the super or subnatural, whichever direction you're going. What we're talking about here is representing another person and play acting that person. And so when that person gets flattened again and reduced to, and a culture gets reduced to a kind of monolithic representation that we put on and then take off as a play act without having any deeper understanding or relationship with, that's a problem. Because it does not honor the dignity of who that person is. And it creates a hierarchy of dignity, which is, if you read Ibram Kendi, sort of one of the basic ideas of it's what is at the heart of racism, is that it's creating an inequality between races. So, I mean, I can't even think of a caricature of a white person that someone would put on, right? But we're going to caricature, which means we're going to exaggerate certain characteristics. We're going to downplay other characteristics. We're going to flatten this into a kind of monolithic representation. That indicates a kind of hierarchy of dignity and respect. That's the main problem that we're talking about here. So this is not the same as costuming might have been might have been embodied historically. If I'm wrong, someone will have something to say. So then the question to your question about Moana. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that we're correct, that a great deal of care was put into this character to honor Polynesian culture. If this character is truly a hero, then that is someone that we esteem, right? So there are characteristics of that person that we cherish and hold in high value. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing until those characteristics that Moana represents as Polynesian become flattened to the single representation in the movie. So if Moana becomes a window for an entry point into a greater exploration of Polynesian women, of Polynesian gender roles, of Polynesian culture, of Polynesian values that then are esteemed as a whole and not just as Moana, then Moana becomes a kind of sacrament of that larger thing. But if you're not actually connecting with that larger thing, she's not a sacrament, she's just a kind of flat symbol.
Yeah, I think the key, and I think that's the piece that's the key, that's the difference between appreciation and appropriation, is that educational piece of this, especially for children, this character being a hero or a role model for a child, being a place where parents can open the door into a conversation about a culture that they aren't a part of, and learning and reaching out to people and building relationships, right? So that's one of the things we talked about in our cultural appropriation episode was about the relationship piece. And so that's, to me, it's where we take that step from consuming for our own edification, consuming someone's culture for our own benefit, which may just our own pleasure, which may just be, candy, but still. But and also not just candy, but like, oh my God, that's such a cute costume, Moana, I love that movie, right? Like, so the kids getting something out of it, but instead of it just being for our own pleasure, we are actually learning. And I love this idea of going and having the costume made by someone of Polynesian descent, or who is Polynesian, because that is one of those ways of justice, I think. Yeah.
And maybe even then engaging in conversation and relationship with that person, again, not just transactionally. Okay, you made me a costume, so I feel good because the costume came from a Polynesian person. But I'm thinking about Polynesian people in our own culture, in our own community. Well, they're not the same Polynesian that Moana is. So thank you for making the costume. Can you tell me something about your culture? Like, how do you understand yourself to live and move? And have you seen the movie? What did you think about it? What did you see any of yourself in there? What does this imagery in this costume that you've made for me mean to you? How does it bear symbol making for you in terms of representing oneself in the culture, in the world? Now we haven't even gotten to mascots yet.
I know. I was like, we want to transfer over to mascots.
And because I see why they're related on the one hand, because they're both about taking imagery from another culture.
Mm-hmm.
But it also strikes me that a mascot becomes a kind of costume for a group,
Mm-hmm.
right? So a group becomes the Chiefs or becomes the Redskins, to use two major ones
Right.
from sports.
But I mean, and part of the reason why we invited you, Tony, like I would really like to have this conversation from the other side, and the idea of a mascot like the Crusaders,
Mm-hmm.
why that is something that needs to be like. I went to high school. I was a Centurion. I could have a conversation about why that probably should be changed, right? And I think the same conversations are happening at your school, Tony. So I think, maybe it might be interesting to talk about it from from the Christian point of view. What are the reasons that a mascot like the Crusaders might be time to change?
Yeah. So I actually, from a first-person perspective, I'd be speaking from an atheist point of view. But I'm very aware with the Christian point of view from speaking to friends and colleagues and parents on campus and how they felt about it, which they're not a monolith. They have different feelings about it, of course. But in my view, it was easy. I don't have an emotional or faith-based connection to the word. I understand from my friends who do that the Crusades, at least initially, were about reclaiming the Holy Land. I'm not a historian of this, so if I say something incorrect, forgive me. But it was a fight for what was holy to them. And also, I've heard the case made that sort of, I guess, familiar to our political landscape lately, but there were bad people on both sides. So it's sort of absolving any special culpability from the Christian side. For me, it's easy, that particular example. When we have visitors to campus who are Muslim or who are Jewish, let's say, and they see a symbol of a holy war, that sends a message I'm not comfortable with, and I don't really have to think hard about it. I do think it's different for a person of faith. It doesn't mean I agree, but I do think they have a particular attachment to the positive aspects of that imagery that I respect, even if I don't agree. And I feel like I'm beginning to wander here a little bit, but in more general terms, I agree with what Jeffrey said. Mascots represent a group, and if there is, you certainly can go overboard and take something innocuous and find something to be offended about. But if there's a sizable group of your population or a significant enough reason to just not make people feel unwelcome, it seems like an obvious choice. And I know also you get into commerce and things when you're talking about like an NFL team and the almighty dollar. But
Right.
I don't know if I arrived anywhere cogent there, but I tried.
No, the almighty dollar, I think, is behind 99% of this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I have to say, as one who for 8 years had a crusader and is a theologian and actually spends time teaching the history of the Crusades, it's deeply problematic for me. And yeah, there may have been bad people on both sides, but that doesn't excuse the bad behavior on the side of the people who initiated the Crusades.
And you wouldn't allow that from your children. That excuse wouldn't fly with your kids.
Right. And it's really clear from the very beginning of the First Crusade, before they ever got to the Holy Land, there was a great deal of anti-Semitic and massacre going on. I mean, this wasn't just about reclaiming the Holy Land. There was a lot of other stuff going on there. And the further we get into the Crusades, second, third, fourth, the more they are used as political tools within the political structure of Western Europe to deflect attacks from other Western powers, or to create Western alliances in order to strengthen against other Western powers. And this was a way to spiritualize a political move, period.
Yeah.
So I'm just not comfortable with that at all. And I'd be happy to talk to anyone about this at length, but we don't have time today.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the piece of it, is we romanticize history to make us feel better about it. And so that's where I think that, especially with mascots that are not a cultural appropriation, but a romanticization of maybe a more sordid history. This time goes by so fast. This is a tough. It seems like a light conversation, but it's really not. It's really hard, because these are things that have literally been ingrained in us since we were children. I mean, Jeffrey and I both wore Indian costumes as children, right? Like, you know, to this day, if I wear my hair in braids, like, that's, you know, somehow an Indian princess reference. So be kind to yourself as you continue to think about this and think about what your beliefs are, and feel that tug. I think, Tony, the way that you framed that at the beginning is a great example of how many of these conversations pull us in many directions, and we have to keep working toward justice. That is why we do what we do. So continue to have the hard conversations, and don't take your foot off the gas. We'll look forward to seeing you next week when we talk about something else.
Thank you, guys.
Peace.